We hear the term African all the time, used like it's the single, simple description. But what if that whole idea, the very concept of one Africa, is actually an illusion? Well, today we're going to dig into a powerful argument that says it is.
All right, let's just start with a quick thought experiment. Picture this. You have a Fang person from Gabon, an Ovimbundu person from Angola, and a Wolof person from Senegal. They all end up living abroad, maybe in Japan or Mexico. What's the one thing they suddenly and maybe surprisingly have in common? You got it. Even though they have totally different languages, cultures, and traditions, they're often just lumped together and called African. And that one little label is the exact illusion we're going to break down today. And that brings us right to the heart of the argument from our source, which puts it pretty bluntly, there is no such thing as one Africa. Africa is a mosaic, not a monolith. And that single idea, that diversity is the reality, that's the foundation for everything we're about to talk about. Okay, so where does this oversimplification even come from? Well, the argument kicks off by pointing out what looks like a pretty clear double standard in how we talk about culture.
I mean, think about it for a second. When someone's from Europe, we get specific, right? We say they're German or French or Spanish. But for someone from Africa, the label often just stops at African. It's a huge difference in how we apply these IDs. So why is that?
And that's really the core question here, isn't it? Why do we apply this broad, generic standard to a continent with 54 different countries, each with its own incredibly rich identity?
To really get this, we got to talk about what identity is at its core. It's shaped by these two things that are completely tangled up together, language and culture. They're what create that shared understanding, that real sense of belonging. So if language and culture are the building blocks, how much are they really shared across Africa? This is where it gets fascinating. You take Igbo and Hausa, both spoken in Nigeria. They have 0 words in common. None. Same goes for Bambara in Mali and Twi in Ghana. This incredible diversity is a direct challenge to the whole idea of a single, unified African culture.
So this leads to a pretty big paradox. If the continent is so wildly diverse, where in the world did this idea of a unified Pan-African identity even come from? Let's dig into its surprising origins.
The argument here is that the modern Pan-African ideal was really born out of the diaspora, specifically the descendants of enslaved Africans living in the West. Because they were cut off from their specific ancestral languages and cultures, a new identity had to be forged, one built around that shared experience of displacement. And this really makes the difference crystal clear. On the continent of Africa itself, identity is tied to your ethnic group, your language, your specific culture. But for so many in the diaspora, identity had to be rebuilt around a shared history, and that label, African. You see? They're two completely different starting points for what identity even means.
So what does all this actually look like in the real world, on the ground? Well, this idea of a unified Africa runs into some pretty big hurdles. Just look at this number. Over 300. That's not a typo. That's how many distinct ethnic groups there are inside the borders of Nigeria alone. 300. That's just an insane amount of diversity packed into one country. And what's the real-world impact of that? While the source puts it bluntly, saying that these groups, quote, frequently view each other as foreigners within Nigeria's borders. This can lead to all sorts of tensions and makes finding common ground a real challenge. So it really makes you wonder, right? If just getting unity inside a single country is this much of a struggle, especially one with borders drawn by outsiders, how could we possibly expect it to work across an entire continent of 54 different nations? So, if unification is an illusion, what's the game plan? This is where the argument pivots, and it suggests a totally new framework. Think collaboration, not unification. Now, let's be super clear about what unification means here. It's this idea of creating one single, unified African state, basically wiping the current national and cultural map clean. And here's the alternative, collaboration. In this model, you have sovereign nations working together for their collective good. Think of it kind of like the European Union, but while respecting and preserving their own distinct identities, languages, and cultures. And look, the reasoning for this is super practical. The argument is that the #1 priority, before anything else, should be improving the lives of the actual citizens within their own countries. When you've got millions living on less than $2 a day, basic needs have to come before these massive continent-wide ambitions.
And to wrap this all up, the argument zooms out from the big geopolitical picture, right down to the deeply personal, to what identity really means to an individual.
The author of our source concludes with this incredibly powerful and personal statement. I am not an African. I am an Igbo with a Nigerian nationality. It's just a raw declaration of a specific, layered identity. Let's just break that down because the distinction is so important. The core identity, that's ethnic and cultural, Igbo. The nationality, that's political, Nigerian. And that big label, African, the author argues that as an identity, it means nothing in reality. So when you boil it all down, this is the main takeaway. Real identity is local, it's cultural. Nationality is political, it's a creation of the state. And that continental label, well, that's just geography.
And this all leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. For a continent of 54 distinct countries, all facing their own immense challenges, should the top priority be the real, tangible development of their citizens? Or should it be the pursuit of a more abstract ideal of unity? It's a powerful question to think about.